yeah, I'm going to start off by saying it's a good time to read Trotsky. I mean, it's always a good time to read Trotsky, but I'm going to say right now it's especially important. Sorry, my computer just turned off. If you get anything out of this meeting, I think hopefully it will be that Trotsky always believed in the power and the potential of workers. And of course, this is what we as revolutionary socialists must always keep in the forefront of our minds today and any day. He absolutely believed, as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels did, that capitalism creates its own grave diggers, so the working class. And of course, the power of workers was absolutely shown just last week, whilst rail strikers took to picket lines, completely switching off the network, terrifying the Tories and the bosses alike. It was absolutely a show of power by workers. And you know, other workers in different industries would have almost certainly seen this as well. But of course, as socialists, we can't just cheerlead. Strikes and workers' fightbacks brings up really important questions for our movement. Firstly, a good question is, how can this workers' power socialists always speak of turn into a force that can transform society? How can picket lines, how can strikes turn into revolution? Hopefully in this meeting it's a big question, but I'll try and answer some of these questions. So of course there's a lot to say about Trotsky, and I will miss a lot. I can't go over it in a 25-minute meeting, and I think it's important that people put their hands up and talk about other currents of his theory during the discussion. So just to kind of begin, and just as a short aside, while I'll be talking mainly about Trotsky's ideas, I think it's important to highlight for a moment the very real and practical service that he did for the revolutionary current and in Russia, and then of course across the world. You know, in 1917, as president of the Soviets, he organized the October insurrection that established workers' power in Russia. He became a chief organizer of the 5 million strong Red Army, which defeated counter-revolutionary forces that were backed by Western imperialism. Finally, he left the left opposition, which tried, of course, sadly, unsuccessfully to resist the rise of Stalin and defend workers' democracy and the ideas of revolution. He was truly a man who contributed not only intellectually, but in a very practical sense in leading the revolutionary current within Russia. Through all of this, he was able to draw on what he had seen and come up with many of the theories we as revolutionary socialists come back to time and time again in our practice and in our theory. And the main one, and I want to focus on this one, I hope everyone's all right with that. In this meeting, I'd really like to focus on the theory, the theory of permanent revolution, which Trotsky developed from the writings of Marx and Engels. It's important to say that Trotsky was forming his ideas about permanent revolution as he was seeing a revolutionary process in action. The 1905 Russian Revolution is often thought of as a dress rehearsal for the 1917 revolution. It was a year of strikes and agitation. A union of sorts was set up by a priest, agitator and police informer, Georgy Gapon, who marched along with thousands of workers to appeal to the Tsar at his gates of his palace. The Tsar's regime would not be reasoned with. They fired on workers, killing up to 4,000 and revealing the Tsar to be the workers' oppressor-in-chief. Strikes spread and the navy mutinied. For the first time, workers' councils were set up, which provided a higher form of workers' democracy than had been seen before. Of course, it took terror and repression to crush Russia's first revolution, but it was revealed that the Russian working class were not only willing to fight, but had real potential to be a powerful force within society. So at just 26, I think people forget that, how young Trotsky was. He was watching all of this unfold. He didn't simply fall into despair that workers' uprisings were defeated in 1905. It gave him both hope and also vital insight. And it went against some of the kind of ideas that other revolutionaries believed at the time. Some thought that Russia was far too backward, or it hadn't undergone capitalist development for a long enough time to have a workers' revolution. This idea was reflected in the ideas of two sides of the revolutionary movement at the time in Russia, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks believed that the revolution would be led by progressive elements of the middle class, and that workers could fight for better conditions and be, well, sort of like a left force, but their power just wouldn't be truly realised. So the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, they differed in opinion to that. They thought that the Russian ruling class was terrified of the power of workers and who would really desperately cling onto the old order, so the Tsarist state, for protection. Any revolution would be limited to a bourgeois democratic revolution, so a political revolution to dispose the current political order and then put in a new one. This would give space for democracy, for workers to be able to form unions, and for capitalism to further develop in Russia. They argued that only after this could workers begin the fight for socialism, but have a truly realised socialist revolution. Trotsky had a slightly different idea, and it was formed from his observations of the very nature of Russian society at the time. You know, Russia had not developed in the same way as countries like Britain and France. It was a country of contradictions and contrasts, of unevenness. The Tsarist regime had, in order to compete with other world powers, imported some of the newest technology in the world to be used in production. They'd done this by begging, borrowing, stealing from financiers from across the West. This led to some of the most advanced production being funneled into Russia into the time. A good example of this was in 1905, Russia was home to one of the biggest steelworks in the world. And of course, none of this was possible without workers. This drive to develop production quickly had led to a comparatively small but very concentrated and militant working class form. In contrast to this, though, swathes of Russians were still peasants who lived off the land and actually had some of the most backward agriculture in the world. This is what I mean by contradictions and contrasts, and as Trotsky called it, combined and uneven development. But despite the backwardness of large areas of Russia, Trotsky saw the potential for a socialist revolution in the country. He saw that workers were part of the revolutionary movement, didn't have to stop at making basic democratic reforms. They could cast off the old order completely and shape Russian society anew. He saw that workers could make their own demands, forming their own kind of democracy, and he believed that the peasantry could be brought on side if workers provided a good enough lead. He caught a glimpse of this after the 1905 revolution, when workers began to form workers' councils to organise from below. And from this onwards, Trotsky started to really form his ideas of permanent revolution. The theory meant that revolution doesn't have to stop at a halfway house, so stop at disposing an old government and putting in a new one, so kind of a capitalist democratic revolution. It can skip this and become socialist revolution. And of course, we all know that the 1905 revolution didn't break through. It was crushed, but Trotsky was proven right in 1917. The 1917 revolution went beyond a political revolution. Workers not only got rid of the Tsar, they started running things for themselves. When the workers and soldiers of St. Petersburg overturned the Tsarist regime in February, their first thought was to form Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies to give the growing radical mood, the growing feeling of revolution a voice. From February of 1917, the Soviets had dual power with a provisional government made up of moderate parties in Russia. Trotsky knew this was far too unstable. A truly socialist revolution was needed to put workers truly in charge. As the leader of the Revolutionary Military Committee, Trotsky played a decisive role in the October Revolution that saw workers seize power. You know, Trotsky convinced Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin that the Soviets, not the Bolsheviks, should issue the call for insurrection. And the Soviets were true democracy in action. You know, they were workers seizing control. And it proved that the Russian working class was actually very capable of running things for themselves. And I think this was Trotsky's theory in practice. You know, of course you might say, why is this relevant today? Russia isn't the same as it was in 1905 or 1917. Britain isn't the same as it was, you know, in 1905 or 1917. The revolutionary conditions just aren't the same. But what Trotsky saw in this revolutionary situation and what he wrote about when he talked about permanent revolution is still very relevant today. You might say capitalism, it's got its hooks in everything now. How could it be possible that the same kind of conditions that happened during the Russian Revolution could happen today? How can we have the same set of uneven conditions that led to the Russian Revolution? I would consider the only truly socialist revolution. How can that happen somewhere else? But Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution shows us there is hope for workers' revolution everywhere. In the last few years, we have seen explosions of anger by ordinary people across the world, especially in the global south. This anger and this, that often starts with protest over the price of fuel, protest over the price of bread, has disposed of governments and dictators from Algeria to Sudan. We saw this, of course, this kind of revolutionary upheaval, this revolutionary anger in Egypt in 2011, when the movement on the street forced out the dictator Hosni Mubarak in just 18 days. And we saw the wave of revolts that spread across the Middle East during the same time period. At the same time, the time of the revolution, Egypt was considered less developed than most countries in the West. While the working class were and still are a powerful force within this country, in 2011 they had only just started to kind of form trade unions, and still large numbers of the population still worked on the land. But this did not stop an uprising that terrified world leaders across the world and inspired millions of workers across the globe. Some just kind of anecdotally, some workers organised committees and ran things in defiance of the bosses. It was once again a show of the revolutionary potential of workers. But ultimately, workers in Egypt needed to go a step further. They needed to move to running things for themselves. Had they done so, they could have won soldiers over to opposing their regime and strengthened the revolution. They could have fought off the repression that ultimately crushed the revolution. Of course, I can't just stand here and say, this is how things should have gone. We're in Britain at the moment. I was also 14 when all of this was going on. But this moment shows us some of Trotsky's ideas in practice. It shows us the potential of a small but militant working class to wield great power, even in a country that is considered to be less economically developed. And I think we can see a very similar thing going on in Sudan at the moment. I saw actually on a WhatsApp group there's going to be a protest over Sudan in Manchester, and I think maybe next week. These small revolutionary committees organising, once again showing the revolutionary potential of workers. But I think what happened in Egypt, and also what happens across the world, shows us another really important thing, another really important aspect of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, and that is clearly that revolutions, in order to survive, they need to spread. At the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, this was a real possibility. The 1917 Russian Revolution, really helped spark uprisings in Germany, in Hungary, and elsewhere. While, Trotsky had every faith in the Russian working class, he knew that the revolution needed to spread to more economically developed countries to sustain socialism. He knew revolution could not be isolated due to the interconnectedness of the capitalist system as a global system. This is in, of course, stark opposition to the ideas of Joseph Stalin, who believed that there could be socialism in one country. Well, I don't know if he believed it, but he certainly said it. Stalin's counter-revolution, took place from the mid-1920s onwards, after the death of Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin. Russia was left politically and economically isolated as the revolutionary movement failed to break through into other countries. Stalin destroyed everything that was fought for in 1917. The Soviets were the first thing to go. The revolution was no longer permanent, it was postponed. And Trotsky famously wrote that Stalin was the gravedigger of revolution. Russia became not a socialist society at all. It was a state capitalist society presided over by a tyrant. and Trotsky had to watch on as this happened. And of course, free for his life, as Stalin's assassins pursued him across the world. It's important to say, in exile, Trotsky never stopped writing, and he never stopped fighting for the true socialist spirit that had been seen in 1917. He wrote about many things during this time. Fascism is a really important one, and I hope in the discussion we can talk a little bit about Trotsky and the United Front, though I don't think I've got time to do it in the meeting. Trotsky's murder in Mexico in 1940 by Stalin's agent just showed how dangerous his ideas, showed how dangerous ideas about permanent revolution and about working class emancipation from below were. And this idea of socialism from below that Trotsky held onto so tightly is still just as dangerous today. Workers' organising is truly what makes the bosses shake. Well, I really like seeing Mick Lynch on the TV owning journalists and doing clever quips. Those at the top of the society, I don't think they're really scared of Mick Lynch. They're scared of the millions of workers who have looked to the rail strikes and thought, oh, I can do that. This is the spirit that I think Trotsky fought for. And I think in the grips of a climate crisis, in the grips of a cost of living crisis, and of course, the continuous drag to unending war, I think that's what we have to fight for today. We have to fight for the true spirit of socialism. And I think what's really important to say is when the revolution comes, I don't think that the person on the lips of workers will be Stalin. I think it will be Trotsky. So, thank you.